Hello and welcome to D&D 101 here on the Bardic Quest YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Wayne Ingram. I am a D&D enthusiast, a full-time Dungeon Master, and the Dungeon Master here for our actual play series, Bardic Quest, here on YouTube. We have spoken in the last D&D 101 video of what is Dungeons & Dragons. For those that were D&D curious and have never played Dungeons & Dragons, what the game actually is, and by association what it means to actually play a tabletop role-playing game such as Dungeons & Dragons. I was going to do a video on how the game actually works and how you actually play the game. But before I did that, I wanted to actually touch on a video that I think is a little bit more important, which is the social contract of Dungeons & Dragons and what it means to be a good player. Because we must remember that D&D is a cooperative game. It's something that you enjoy as part of it's a social event. It's not just a game, it's an excuse to get round the table or log on to Discord or whatever it is that you use to play, to get together and socialize with friends or maybe new people around an activity. And so with that comes a certain degree of etiquette that comes with playing the game. So I wanted to touch on these things before I do a video on how to actually play the game. Because, as I say, Dungeons & Dragons is not something that you do alone. Most importantly, it is vital that everybody has fun when they're playing Dungeons & Dragons. Remember as well that the Dungeon Master is playing the bad guys, your allies, any character that is not one of you, the heroes, and is also setting up all of the fights, the story, and everything. So it's really important to remember that your Dungeon Master isn't your enemy here. Your Dungeon Master is here to enjoy the game with you as well. And the unspoken social contract that is often around the game of Dungeons & Dragons, and it is unspoken, so there's some room for interpretation, is there to ensure that everybody has fun. That's really the reason why such a thing exists. But again, it can vary from table to table, but I want to cover in this video a lot of the things that I think are mostly widely accepted as ways to behave and to engage with the game. So you have to remember that this is fundamentally a hobby. It's not just a game for some people, it is a hobby. A regular thing that they do. And if you are getting into this game, it's important to make sure that you respect that as best as you can. As I say, it's a social event. You're getting around the table or logging on Discord to enjoy some social time. It is a social event. It is something that you mark in your calendar and you look forward to. An activity, if you will. Remembering then that everybody who plays D&D is there for the sole purpose of having fun. It's escapism, and so we want to ensure that it is enjoyable for everyone around the table. But remember that your fun is not the only fun that matters. There are other players there as well. So you should come into it with the intent of cooperating with everybody else to achieve that sense of communal fun. And that's what's expected from everyone. And people feeling as though that they're being left out or not being able to engage with it in the same way as yourself is something that you're looking to avoid. This isn't the same as logging on to your Xbox and playing Halo and beating the hell out of somebody for your own enjoyment. These are other people coming here to do this cooperative entertainment, if you will. So the second thing really is to be content with the game and the story not being all about you. As I say, this is a cooperative game. It is a cooperative hobby. But also in grander narrative of this story that you're telling as part of Dungeons & Dragons or any tabletop role-playing game really, your character is usually one of several heroes of the story. And that's certainly the case in Dungeons & Dragons. And just as the game and the enjoyment of the game is a group effort, so too is the story and the quests that you are going on, or the adventures that your characters are going on. That too is a group effort. So every single character in the party of adventurers that you're playing as will have something unique to offer. If you think about Lord of the Rings, for example, which is one of the quintessential fantasy stories that we all think of when we think of Dungeons and Dragons. Even Frodo Baggins often had to take a step back in order to make his quest to Mordor succeed. Vital for any sort of ensemble storytelling that on occasion, the story right now isn't about one particular character or the lead. The focus will move on to a different character whose story or abilities are more appropriate for that moment. And that is completely true of Dungeons and Dragons too. So sometimes a particular moment or scene that you're playing in isn't going to be about you. And that's fine. Take a back seat, maybe interject occasionally, be still involved with the scene, but know when to take a step back and not feel the need to have to step into a scenario to make sure that you've made your mark in this particular scene, for example. And equally, particularly true online as well. Online play can be difficult because sometimes you're talking over one another accidentally because there is delays and lag, and so knowing when to just take a back seat and just let the scene play out without having to interject is a really valuable skill, especially when it comes to playing online. The third point I wanted to make is ensuring that you show up. And this in every sense. Showing up physically and otherwise as well, which I'll get into in a second. But in terms of showing up to your game, of course, life happens. And we have to acknowledge that, to some degree, there are things that are more important than a game of dice and make-believe. People have families, people have health, people have finances that they have to maintain and look after and be responsible for. It's very important that whilst we put Dungeons & Dragons on our pedestal as our hobby of choice, that it doesn't get in the way of other things. When I'm running my tables, I will constantly say to people, family first, work first. But remember that everybody in your D&D group has committed to carving out time in their very busy schedules to play a game of Dungeons & Dragons. The other thing to consider is that the Dungeon Master will likely have committed at least double the amount of time to prepare for that session. That's not an unusual thing for them to have committed that amount of time to. By signing up to play a game of Dungeons & Dragons, you are declaring that D&D for that time in your diary is a recreational priority. You shouldn't be taking better offers, really, because everybody has carved out that specific amount of time. And if too many people take up better offers to go and do other recreational things during that time, that's how D&D campaigns and groups quickly fall apart because of scheduling issues. Again, we acknowledge that life happens and that sometimes you have to take care of your family or your health or your finances or something else. And that's fine. But when you sign up to a D&D game, just remember, you and all of the others have agreed that is the time that you're going to be playing together, and that is your recreational priority during that time. But the other thing to consider as well is make sure that when you come to play, particularly if you're playing in person, that you have everything that you need to be able to play the game. If you're in person, you should have your character sheet. You should have some dice. You should have a copy of the Player's Handbook. Or, at the very least, if you don't want to spend the money on the Player's Handbook, download the system reference document, which you can download for free on .com. Search into Google, Dungeons & Dragons System Reference Document, 5th edition. But you should at least have some form of copy of the rules to play. Now, when you're first playing, you're not expected to have all of these things. You're probably not expected to have all of the dice and all of the books and things. That's not an expectation when you first begin to play. But you should at least come with everything that you need after the first session. You should have your dice. You should have a copy of the rules. Again, you can access them for free. You should have your character sheet. If you don't bring those things, it can be disruptive to the start of the game. Even if, by the way, having your character sheet means that you have D&D Beyond on your phone if you are allowing digital tools at the table, of course. Speak to your DM about that. But making sure that everything that you need to be able to play is there and ready to go. Likewise, if you're playing online, you need to make sure before game time that everything's working fine. If you know that your internet is particularly bad, then make sure that it's working well before game time. If you know that Discord on your computer can be particularly unpredictable, log in and do a test run. You're testing tools on your Discord to make sure that everything's playing fine. And likewise with Foundry. Log in early and make sure that all of your settings are correct for the internet speed that you have. It's just good practice to do to prevent disruption mid-game, or even delaying the game from actually starting. And don't forget as well, in terms of showing up, that again, your character is one of the main characters of the story, and your party needs you. If you don't show up that day because you had a better offer, then that could have dire consequences for your other party members and dramatically affect the rest of the campaign. And the other thing, when it comes to showing up, is just make sure as well that when it is game time, that you're paying attention. Again, you've all agreed that this is a recreational priority for you, so you want to be present. Some DMs refuse to allow digital devices at the table, and I completely understand why that is the case, because it's very easy for these distraction devices to annoy us a little bit and take our focus away. But what happens when you don't pay attention is that you can often end up going in circles as part of the game. The Dungeon Master is having to describe things multiple times because you missed it the first time, which can slow down the pace of game. You're having to ask everybody, oh yeah, what were we doing? Why were we here again? And you just end up repeating the same thing over and over again. And game time is precious, particularly when you're an adult. When you're having to work and look after your children, do the school run, and all these other things, that game time is very precious. So make sure that you are paying attention for the benefit of your other players, if nothing else. So just make sure that when it comes to game time, that D&D is your sole focus. And if you need to, turn off that phone, eliminate any distractions, do what you need to do to make sure that you can be focused on the game. Number 4 on my list of things is to accept that you ultimately have no control of the story. In fact, I want to take it a step further than that. I mentioned earlier, and again, I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, you're maybe not that much of a veteran of Dungeons & Dragons. And I explained earlier that the Dungeon Master is the one that is setting up the story, setting up the scenarios, setting up the obstacles, playing the enemies. They're designing the game that you are going to, or at least the adventure and the story that you're going to play in. But they don't have full control of the story. Even the Dungeon Master doesn't have full control of the story. In fact, they're only really guiding the story. They're not controlling it. There are a lot of factors that can change the overall trajectory of the story that you're playing in. That could include the dice rolls, which add a lot of chaos into where the story goes. The choices of the other players, never mind yourself. And indeed, the Dungeon Master also gets to influence things a little. But also remember that there are the rules of the game which dictate certain things within the kind of pseudo-reality that we've created in our minds. Because without those rules, we are just playing a game of make-believe like we used to with our friends in the playground at school, where things escalate very quickly and somebody's got a deadly sword, but actually you've got magical armor that defends against a deadly sword, and then they've got a gun that can destroy anti-deadly sword armor, and it just gets ridiculous. And that's what the rules are for, is to prevent things like that. So remember that all of those factors, the dice, the other players, the Dungeon Master, the rules of the game, will affect the direction that the story goes in. And it means that it may not go in the direction that you want it to go, or even the direction that you expect it to go. But that's the fun of the game. Even the Dungeon Master gets to be surprised in this game, not knowing what way things are going to go. And when they are surprised, that brings a great level of energy to the table. So embrace the unpredictability of the game and the fact that it could go in so many different directions. Because otherwise, let's be honest, if you know what direction the story's going in, you may as well be reading a book or watching a film. The other thing as well is that not only does it mean that you have no control of the story, but also you have to understand that the Dungeon Master is there to guide or present what the villains might do. Which means that, yes, your character might get killed as part of their adventures. The villain might outsmart you, and the NPCs that you thought were allies may very well betray you. But this is not a slight on you as a player. This is not the dungeon master trying to beat you at the game. This is all part of the experience. There is not a win state for Dungeons & Dragons. There's only really a lose state of Dungeons & Dragons, which is if everybody's killed. And even if everybody's killed, there are still ways for the story to continue. All of this is to say you have to be okay with all of those things, like your character being killed, things not going to plan, being betrayed by non-player characters. But remember, each such event and each failure of your character as an adventurer, or even your fellow party members, is an opportunity for you to create an even more exciting story than you might have done otherwise. So number 5, and this is a big one. No one really is expected to know all of the rules, all of the game options, all of the time. This is the player's handbook. It's over 300 pages long. There are 3 such core rulebooks to the game, which are all of the options that both players and dungeon masters can use to enjoy this game. Never mind the then additional books that are added to the game, all about 200 to 300 pages long themselves, with more options. There are thousands of elements to this game, whether that be magical items that you can pick up on your adventure, weapons and armor, character races or species, character classes that you can choose from, character backgrounds, spells, diseases, poisons, all sorts of things that can be used as part of this game. It would be impossible for somebody to know all of them, and that includes the Dungeon Master too. No human brain can know everything all of the time as it relates to this game. It's just too complex. Give yourself an easier time when you're trying to learn this game, because it is complex. It can be complex if you don't know where to start. But also, don't expect the Dungeon Master to know all of this stuff either. However, there is one thing that I would say with relation to the etiquette around this game and this social contract is, whilst nobody is expected to know all of the rules and all of the game options all of the time, I think it is a fair expectation for players around the table, and indeed the Dungeon Master, to know how your particular character works. Look at it this way. There are, as I say, thousands of pages of rules and options for this game. For you to learn your character, you need 3 pages at most of rules to learn, which is your character sheet, essentially. Once your character's set in stone and you've got your head around this game a little bit more, understand the basics of it, do put in the effort to learn your character sheet or character sooner rather than later, and know what it is that your character is capable of. Of course, if this is your first game of D&D, some discretion can be given here, and I'm sure it will be. But remember, as it relates to the Dungeon Master, it's the Dungeon Master's job to know how the game works as a whole, not to know how your character works. When you're going to use a spell or use an ability, just make sure that when it comes to your turn, before you declare it, you've got your head around how it works. Or at the very least, have the player's handbook open on the page where that thing that you're about to use happens. Because there's nothing worse than when a player character fires off a spell, and then the Dungeon Master says, "And how much damage does your fireball do?" And the player says, "I don't know. I was hoping you could tell me." That just slows the game right down to a screeching halt, breaks the immersion of the game completely, and completely breaks the flow. So if you're going to cast a spell or something like that, just have it at the ready. Don't necessarily have it memorized, but have it there to be able to just quickly go, oh, it says 3d8. That's not a fireball, but I can't. So, number 6 on my list. Make sure, if you can, that there are notes of the party's exploits. Take notes, please. I would highly recommend that you get yourself a notebook to take notes of the events, of the campaign, of the NPCs that you have met, of the world as you discover it. I would recommend that you do take physical notes in a notebook rather than digital ones. There is science to suggest that handwriting things has it go into your brain a little bit better than just typing things out. And also I find that you end up with disparate documents spread out over various Google Drives or folders and things if you're not careful, whereas a notebook keeps it all in one place. But your mileage may vary. Take your notes how you like, so long as you are taking notes, because these notes could be really invaluable to you later on. Take notes of the people that you meet, the organizations that you encounter, the places that you've been and what's there, and the things that you've found or discovered, or even interesting bits of lore. All of these things may become very important later on in the campaign, so it's best that you've got a good set of notes, particularly because you don't want to have to go to just on memory what happened 10 sessions ago. Better to have some written down notes. And also, just be sure to trust and respect each other with expectations and dice rolls. Again, not everybody's going to know all of the rules of the game. Be willing to accept that perhaps maybe your interpretation of a rule or an ability was wrong, and that perhaps you weren't going to be able to use it as you had intended, and that perhaps you'd interpreted it wrong and need to rethink your strategy. That's fine. Just ensure that when things like that happen, or maybe in-character disagreements come up, that you're treating everybody around the table, whether that be a physical table or a digital one, that you treat them with respect, and you make room for those other people to have their fun too. Again, it's not all about your own fun. This is a collaborative and cooperative game. And that also comes down to the cooperation, ensuring that people have fun whilst they're playing this game. Listen to the other players and to the Dungeon Master. Find your fun within the game that the Dungeon Master's running, and find a way for your character to fit into that world, rather than just pushing against it. And when disagreements do come up, be prepared to use gracefully when it comes to those debates. I like to argue like I'm right, but listen like I'm wrong. I will make a statement in my games. That's how a rule works, I'm sure. And many a time I've been told, no, actually, you are mistaken, Mr. Dungeon Master. The rule should work like this. Sometimes I might look at a rule and say, actually, I'm going to house rule this one because I don't think it should work that way. It doesn't make sense. And that is, of course, my purview as a Dungeon Master, to tweak the rules to fit in with the type of game I'd like to run. For the most part, I'll default to the rules that are written in the game. Just make sure that if you do have one of these debates, that you are willing to back down if you need to. And as I say, find your fun within the game that the Dungeon Master is running with regard to that. There will be rules that might restrict some of the things that you wanted to do, and that's fine. The Dungeon Master is there to help everybody have an enjoyable experience, or they should be. Although your fun is not entirely their responsibility. It is a cooperative thing for everybody to be wanting to do and to achieve. Sometimes, just remember, it's simply somebody else's turn to roll the dice and not your own. Those are the expectations that I have at all of my D&D tables, and I like to think that we managed to achieve a nice equilibrium across all of them. And if you are new to D&D, I hope that that has helped you to understand kind of the expectation for when you arrive at the table, particularly when it comes to knowing the rules of the game, because you don't need to know them all. The Dungeon Master will guide you to start with, and indeed your other players will too. So I hope that's alleviated some of the angst perhaps that you might have around starting this hobby. It is a very fun hobby, and one that you will make very fast friends in, and one that you'll often find lifelong friends come out of this hobby too. Provided, of course, that you all have fun around the table, which is what this social contract of D&D is all about. So thank you, my friends, for tuning in and joining me today for this particular video. If you have found this video helpful, please do me a massive favour and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel as well. It really does help to feed those hungry algorithm gods, and also helps to grow the channel as well. And you will have my eternal thanks if you do. There will be more videos like this coming up, but of course we also have our actual plays where you can see how D&D is played for realsies. And thank you once again for tuning in to this video, and I will catch you next time.